Hello, my name is Joshua Finch, and I am the project manager for the Agroforestry and Nyland project. And today I would like to present an introduction to agroforestry to acquaint you with what agroforestry is at the most fundamental level, provide some information on two of the most common types of agroforestry, share a little bit of information about how we see agroforestry fitting into the Finnish landscape and context, especially Uusimaa, which is the focus of our project. We'll also talk a little bit about how agroforestry goes from idea to practice, and then provide some next steps in case you're interested in agroforestry, would like to know more, and if you're located in Uusimaa and you have a farm or you're producing something for sale from your land and you would like to see if agroforestry could be right for you and your farm, how you could contact us and what we provide. This Introduction to Agroforestry lecture is being recorded from home, so it's always fun to try to do this without an actual audience and speaking to a camera, so I'll do my best. So hopefully it doesn't get too strange. It's a lot easier actually for me to talk in front of people because I know who I'm talking to rather than just to the internet here. So without further ado, let's get into it. I have two images on this title screen. On the left-hand side, we can see a landscape that looks like it's in the dry season with some larger trees in the foreground and then moving up this ridge. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, I think it's pretty obvious that the season has changed. Now it's a wet season. These are two images from the Sahel region in Africa. And I included this, although we're focused on agroforestry in Finland, to provide a very essential thing up front, which is that agroforestry doesn't always mean that you need to plant new trees. So what's going on in these images is a before and after of an area that farmers, villagers, pastoralists have been trained in a technique called Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, FMNR. And it's a very simple technique that conservationists came up with, I think, it could have been over 20 years ago now, in order to train people to see trees and shrubs that are already present in the landscape. So the initial starting conditions look something here on the left. So we have unplanned, unmanaged grazing, and you have a bit of a tragedy of the common situation going on where the grazing, so the light just changed, we have some snow and rain blowing through out of the window here, where the conditions are where no single person owns that land. So there's a lot of overgrazing taking place, a lot of overbrowsing, and the trees don't stand a chance, but they're there. So previously, people had been trying to get people to plant more trees, and eventually someone realized that, wait a minute, there are already enough trees here. And they've trained farmers to manage the transition from trees and shrubs being below the browse line of livestock to get them above the browse line so that they're not necessarily free from danger from the animals, but generally speaking, the animals can't get to the regrowth points of those trees and shrubs anymore, and you can revegetate the landscape using existing conditions. So this is just to get started with the idea that agroforestry is actually a really broad set of practices. It's practiced all around the world, and it takes different forms depending on where you are and what it is that you're trying to achieve. Farmer-managed natural regeneration may not look like this in a Finnish context. However, the basic idea of working with what you already have or what nature would already provide through seed bank, or clones or something like this is actually one method that I believe is overlooked. Especially in the industrialized world, where we're always wanting to buy something in and plant something and do something rather than, depending on what you actually want to get from the system, working with what's already there. It's a much lower cost practice. And if we're worried about the upfront costs of agroforestry, why would we not investigate some of these proven techniques that other people are using around the world? Today, our topics, again, they range from this introduction that we're doing now to talk a bit about why you might do agroforestry. And in that, we'll talk about what agroforestry is. Then we'll look at silvoarable and silvopastoral systems very briefly, but give you a bit of an outline about why those could be interesting for agriculture. Then we'll look at the Finnish context, how agroforestry, in order to do it, what are the main components, and then offer those next steps. As you can see, that index there goes all the way up to 15 slides. So I have a lot of content for you. I hope that that's going to be useful and engaging, because to give a 20-minute presentation on a huge range of practices is actually quite difficult. So this is a bit of a deep dive, but it's still an introduction. Each one of these topics could, we could spend hours actually unpacking these, but today I wanted to present the most essential bits so that you could get started with understanding what agroforestry is. So it's usually good to start with a definition. The most basic definition of agroforestry is that it is the deliberate integration of woody vegetation into agriculture. Now, agroforestry can be practiced outside of agriculture. It can also be practiced at a domestic scale, so a commercially oriented or even subsistence oriented thing. This could be practiced in a backyard or at a summer cottage. But for our intents and purposes for this project, we focus on the agricultural practices of agroforestry. And that definition is short, and it's a bit troublesome because deliberate integration of woody vegetation could be almost anything. And that's one of the beauties actually of agroforestry, is that you can't talk about agroforestry as a whole for very long, because it can be any time that you're bringing these species into a farming context. So as we'll see very soon, that can mean many different things, even at a basic level. But the definition is important to include because of those two words that I've highlighted here, which is deliberate integration. So these two words help us understand that agroforestry doesn't happen by accident. So agroforestry is not simply recognizing that trees exist in your fields, all right, or your pastures. That could be agroforestry, but whether or not it goes from trees are present in the landscape to an agroforestry practice hinges on whether or not there are deliberate relationships and management strategies to integrate those woody species with the ongoing or the future enterprises of the farm. So it doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't also happen in haste. So deliberate means a slow, steady, considered understanding about something. Like, we're going to go through these steps and we're going to make sure that every step of the way this thing makes sense. And then integration simply means that we shouldn't be seeing these as opposing enterprises, that it's a zero-sum game. Either I'm improving my woody crops for agroforestry and decreasing the ability of my non-woody crops, my cereals, legumes, it could be pasture plants, where we're moving things in this direction where one thing is gaining at the expense of the other. Good agroforestry practice integrates the two so that you build benefits for both the trees and the existing herbaceous plants. So let's keep that in mind. It doesn't mean there are never any trade-offs, but taken as a whole, when you take all of the production, you should see more production through an agroforestry system rather than less. So let's look at what some of these things can be. This image here is what I've called an illustrated agroforestry typology. It's slightly out of date, and it's based off of some of these documents that are being produced at a European Union level, especially through the European Agroforestry Federation and associated projects. This one in particular was from an EU-wide project called Ag Forward, and in there they have these text boxes. So similar to what I did with the definition, but no pictures to accompany what they're talking about. So let's unpack this image. You could do that on your own, I'm sure, but let's do this together and start on the left-hand side. So I've already said that we're going to focus on agriculture in this project. So if the land use is agriculture, we're looking at dividing the agroforestry practices, somewhat arbitrarily, but for ease of understanding, into practices that take place within fields, so inside the field boundary. So those will move up here if you follow those arrows. or between fields. So between the boundaries of fields or between fields and forests, fields and other land use types. And when you make that division between practices that are taking place in field and practices that are taking place between fields, this changes some of the desired outcomes usually. So let's walk through a few examples of that. Within fields, I've highlighted two main agroforestry practices, and you'll notice that these are the same two that we'll talk about quite soon. We'll look at both silvoarable and silvopasture. So in English, it's a combination from the Latin silvo, either tree or forest. Actually, it's not tree, it's forest. So silvoarable is trees in farming, and silvopasture is trees in pastures, so places that are either going to be grazed or hay will be made or silage will be made or some kind of fodder will be produced from the non-woody plants, but then we're integrating woody plants back into that system. With both of these agroforestry practices, the orientation of bringing trees in there is usually going to be to increase overall production and maybe even provide something to sell from the trees. So these are what I would call production-oriented agroforestry practices. You should get a measurable result from those practices that is either in weight and mass or euros even. When you go down below to the darker green agroforestry practice, I've labeled these, which are here on the right, under ecosystem services. So hedgerows, windbreaks, riparian buffers. These three are by no means the only kind of agroforestry practices that take place between fields, but these are three main ones that usually play a supporting role in the landscape. The hedgerows, the windbreaks, the riparian buffers can include production species. You can have a cash crop component or something that can be easily measured. But typically, if you're looking for the benefit of that system, it's in the way it supports ongoing enterprises. So for example, a windbreak can support the animal welfare of livestock that are in the leeward side. So a well-designed windbreak will create an area where you reduce the impact of wind, which is evapotranspiration. And if the winds are strong enough, it can actually, not with animals, but with plants, you can actually break plants, you can bend them over. Different languages use different words to describe that. In English, we would call that, wind lodging. So wind lodging is something that you can reduce with windbreaks. So the point of integrating the windbreak is to support the growth of whatever it is you're already doing. Whether or not you have secondary objectives for the windbreak is up to you. It all depends on your context and what it is you're interested in doing and your resources and all of this. But that is to say that we've got 6 different examples of 3 categories of agroforestry practice. So the examples here, I have illustrated these myself. They're very simple. They're meant to be in these little tiles so that in a bounded space you can see kind of what that idea means. So as I'm speaking, hopefully you've been looking at these pictures and trying to figure out what it was that I was drawing here. And we can see how on the left-hand side, we have a field here of some kind of grain that's ready to be harvested, or maybe it was already harvested. And there are no trees inside the area where the grain is growing. But if we follow the arrow to silvoarable systems, you can see now that there's 1, 2, 3 rows of trees integrated into there. And very simple, it's alley cropping. You're creating these streets, so to speak, in your farm between where the trees are growing. And you continue to crop what you're always cropping there, but you've layered in some other trees, and we call that alley cropping. And on goes down the line. So hopefully these very simple images here are something that you can use when you hear the word silvoarable rather than trying to remember perhaps grade school Latin or something like this and piece out what it means. Let's just put a little picture with it. I'm not going to go into the other side of this infographic. It's a bit too much for today's work. So let's go on to the next portion of this, which I understand it's a little bit heavy at the start, but we're going to have a lot more photos very soon. And we have a lot of slides to get into to unpack some of what I've already discussed. But there's a big difference between the original definition that I've put up here on the left and the definition which is here on the right. One is that there's a lot more words on the left-hand side, but also you can see that we have some numbers and some percentages. By introducing numbers and percentages, we've changed the definition, which is useful for understanding what agroforestry is, into something that could be measured. And this definition that can be measured, which puts a 5% tree cover floor on deciding what an agroforestry parcel is, comes from the first recommendation that the European Agroforestry Federation has made to the Commission for standardizing or harmonizing the definition of agroforestry across EU countries. And the reason I put that on there isn't because this is what is in the recommendations from the Commission. This is going to the Commission, but it's to highlight two main things. First, 5% tree cover. 5% tree cover is very minimal, but very small numbers of trees, either individually or in small groups or scattered, brought into landscapes where we don't have trees, so you're going from 0 trees to some trees, is actually beneficial enough that we should be promoting it. So let's not get it into our heads that agroforestry means turning fields into forests. It can be as simple as bringing in a small number of trees, even at 5% tree cover. So that's something that can be measured using remote sensing. And then finally, I highlighted the word shrubs. So shrubs are bushes, shrubs. Usually they're multi-stemmed, but they're smaller than trees. Shrubs may also be present. Shrubs are also a woody group of species, and shrubs can play a very important role in our Finnish context because we have very limited light resources, and if we only think about which kinds of trees we would want to bring in, we can quickly start to have too many trade-offs and we don't get useful integration from the agroforestry practice. What we want to do is also remember that there's a whole group of species that can be considered as shrubs that are also woody that can bring many of the same benefits as trees. What does that look like? Well, this is a drone image from our pilot project in Kirkkonummi, where we're aiming for something like the tree rows to use about 10% of the trial plot. It's an 8,000 square meter plot, and we're using about 10% tree cover, but we think that even bringing 10% trees into a single field is useful enough. It's double the floor that NylAF is recommending that the EU use to harmonize the definition. So 10% is actually probably a pretty good place to go. You start getting above 10%, it might be difficult to do a Silvoarable system, which is what this project is going to be. It doesn't look Silvoarable at the moment because we're in the process of converting this grassland back into annual and biennial cropping systems, but it's going to move back into an alley cropping situation. And we think that we're really pushing the edge of what you could do and the number of trees in there. Today's presentation is not focused on that project. We have a website where we describe, in pretty thorough detail almost every aspect of that project. So I would encourage you to check that out. We'll give you the link at the end of this presentation. But I just wanted to show you that's what it can look like. So we've gone from definition to typology, illustrated with some, maybe somewhat cartoonish, but intentionally so, along with a more legalistic definition, and then finally presenting you with what an agroforestry field can look like in Finland. And this is one of the first Silvoarable systems in the country, surprisingly. There are a lot of fields that have trees in there, but whether they were deliberately integrated and created, designed to work together is a different question. So why would you choose to bring trees or shrubs back into your fields? Well, on this slide I've provided 3 things that agroforestry can do, some of which are inherent to agroforestry. So what that means is that you're going to get these things regardless of whether you plan for them. And then the first one actually is something that is not inherent to agroforestry. So just by bringing trees into your farm does not mean that your profitability, so starting here on the left, that your profitability is going to increase. There is nothing about agroforestry that means you'll make more money. But it can improve profitability depending on the work that you put into designing, planning, redesigning, replanning, and then thoughtfully managing the implementation of an agroforestry system. These systems last for decades. They can last for centuries. So the planning process is crucial to making sure that you, at least at the beginning, have some idea of where you're going, what it's going to cost, and what you expect from the system, so that you can ask questions in the future whether or not you're on track to meet your goals. No goals, no plan, very difficult to actually manage well in the end. So much better to have that up front, because often in Finland, agroforestry is something new for your farm. So if you're going to do something new, you might as well plan it in a lot of detail. And that's one of the things our project is here to help with. So in the photo that accompanies this idea about profitability, we can see that there is a row of garlic growing next to the perennials that are in this pilot project that we manage. Now, this isn't very typical that farmers will plant an annual cash crop next to their trees, but it's an idea that we're testing in this site because we think it's very useful for reducing the return on investment window that a lot of agroforestry projects have, especially the ecosystem service agroforestry practices that don't directly produce any revenue. So the return on investment can be hard to calculate sometimes. It can be a bit ambiguous whether or not that windbreak, for example, is actually giving you a yield boost, or was it the change in management of, for example, a wheat crop? Did you do something there with nutrient management or with your soil? What was it that gave you a yield increase? Hard to say if the windbreak is the one doing that job, especially if you're making a lot of different changes on your farm. So it's really important to consider how we can improve the profitability of your agroforestry system. So I put that first. In the center, I recognize that photo is a bit grainy, and that's because it's a screenshot from a video from Saudi Arabia, actually, where in a place where there's basically no rainfall, sometimes for years on end, there was an ecological restoration project that was helping a community of Bedouins who had been settled. They were no longer being nomadic. They weren't allowed to be nomadic. They were forced to be settled. There was deforestation. Yes, there was actually deforestation that took place in Saudi Arabia after they were settled, overuse of resources. So they came in, and agroforestry was one of the primary tools that they used to help reboot the landscape. And that's because agroforestry is multifunctional. So in that particular image, you can see there's a line of stones working its way from the foreground into the background. And these stones are part of a water harvesting system, so that when it does rain and it doesn't penetrate into that bare, hard ground and starts to run off through the landscape, they can slow, spread, and sink the water. And when the water sinks, it needs to go to biology in order to be used. Otherwise, it's just going to go down to the aquifer or come out of the ground somewhere else. So you want to direct it to something. Directing it to dry, arid climate supporting, not supporting, but what's the correct term here? Adapted species. These look like some kind of acacia. You can actually begin to regenerate the landscape. So as a tree grows, it shades the ground, it reduces evaporation. As the tree gets older, it starts to flower. When it flowers, honeybees, in this case, can pollinate those trees, producing more seeds of a plant that can survive in that environment, but also produce honey for the community to sell. So agroforestry in this sense is something that's working as an ecosystem service for water harvesting. It's creating beneficial habitat which didn't exist or was severely reduced there, and it's also producing revenue streams. So you've probably gotten to the title of that part now, which is multifunctional. Agroforestry systems are actually inherently multifunctional, but how many of those functions are high performing comes down to your design, management, implementation of that agroforestry system. So just because you plant a tree and it creates habitat doesn't necessarily mean that it's producing the kind of habitat that would be beneficial for your farm. If you want to leverage that habitat creation into benefits for the farm, you need to be very careful about which trees you bring into the landscape. So this is something that in that particular project they did. Now, our landscape in Finland, coming back to Kirkkonummi actually, this is just downslope from that pilot project there. Agroforestry is an ecologically sound family of practices to choose from because our climate and our ecosystem here supports the growth of trees. It's one of the reasons why Finland is so covered in forests. It's because trees tend to grow fairly well here. So what that means is that bringing trees into farms is something that doesn't require necessarily the same kind of massive, this was a big effort to create these water harvesting features in this landscape that is falling apart basically. Our landscape is a lot more forgiving. The trees don't necessarily need that kind of infrastructure to survive, and we have a wide range of trees, if you compare us to Saudi Arabia, that are going to do well here. And that's pretty useful because if we have areas on our agricultural land, for instance, in this image, we can see that there is a crop. This was oats. So this is a plot of oats that a stream, there used to be a stream here that would run down from this pond down to a wetland and then come out to the bay. That's only a few kilometers away from here. When we had a big rain in 2023, 100 millimeters or so in a weekend, that water level rose, went over the dam, so the walled earth that makes the pond itself went down, and you can see how it carved it found its old channel once again, and it decimated some parts of the landscape there. Maybe that area, instead of planting it or leaving it bare, planting it with oats or planting it with an annual crop that has a shallow root system, in comparison to perennials. Annuals, generally speaking, have very shallow root systems. We could redesign that part of the farm that is erosion prone and put in trees that produce products for us that aren't going to get washed away, that might actually be able to slow down that water and use that water in a different way. So agroforestry can improve our profitability. It's multifunctional inherently, and also is an ecologically sound set of practices to select from for our area. Could go on for each of these. Each of these topics could be its own presentation, actually. But let's keep moving. So now we're moving from general ideas about what agroforestry can do for your farm, what it looks like, what the different practices are, and let's look at a couple of these, big agroforestry systems that are probably going to be the most interesting for people. Maybe not. There are other practices too, but I want to highlight some of the ways we think about these two, and you might get the impression then that almost any agroforestry practice we can provide through our project. Lots of information about them. So let's start off with the Silvoarable systems. At its most basic, that means combining trees with annuals. Now, in your cropping system, you might have biennials. You might have a multi-species cover crop that runs for a few years. I understand it's not always annuals, but it is most basic. It means combining trees with places that you grow annual crops, so things that live for 1 year. I put 3 considerations here, first, second, and third. We'll start again on the left with mechanization. So the design and management always takes into consideration not only the machines you use now, but the machines that you might like to use going into the future on your farm. That future orientation is so critical, not just because the trees are going to last for a long time, but because you have multiple enterprises running in parallel and becoming integrated with one another. So the design and planning of an agroforestry system actually supports your current enterprises by asking you to plan ahead, maybe even further than you already are, with the current systems. Where do you want to take your cropping? Do you want to increase the size of your planter, of your combine, of your boom sprayer? Are you going to have a new hay baler or something like this that requires a certain amount of space to work? Are these things that you want to do? Well, if those changes are on your mind, then we need to take them into consideration now as we plan this agroforestry system that's going to live for decades on your farm. Because what we don't want to do is have the trees become a burden or an interfering factor on your normal operations of your farm. With this image, this is also from our pilot site. This is one of the reasons why we have a pilot site, so we can capture photographs like this and we can show you what agroforestry can look like in Finland. There's actually 2 pictures from Finland on this slide. You can guess which one is the other one. But on the left-hand side, you can see that there's a 4-meter wide drill planting into the alleys. This was spring of 2023. We were in a drought. We were trying to break that grass and put it into a multi-species cover crop. Well, our site was actually planned for using a 3-meter wide planter, which usually necessitates a smaller tractor and also they're a little bit more compact, that whole setup. Yet, going up to a 4-meter wide planter, the contractor was still able to plant the alleys end to end, with just that very tiny little bit where you just can't get some seeds going. You have to actually start moving before the seeds start dropping. And he was able to get there. But if you have a keen eye, you will see here we have some fence posts. He was just barely able to get that entire ensemble into the headlands. And that is something that we don't want to take place on anyone else's farm unless you are, like us, doing a pilot project where sacrificing some of the efficiency brings you gains in the data or the information you need to trial a new idea. So this is, again, something we talk about with our agroforestry pilot project, is that the things that we do there don't always transfer one-for-one to other farms in Finland, but we can highlight exactly why you would not make that trade-off in the design phase, because slowing down, stopping, and almost running into a fence is something nobody ever wants to do. So we can show you quite clearly why we have, generally, as a rule of thumb, quite big headlands for a silvoarable system. Now, moving on to shade and succession. This photograph is actually from, he was taken as part of the Silvoarable for Europe project, or was popularized by this EU project, but it's from France. And you've got poplar trees and wheat. You have 2 monocultures, actually. Monoculture of a cereal and a monoculture of a timber crop growing in the same field. Clearly, these have been growing for a few years. Yes, trees grow faster in France than they do in Finland. Yet at the same time, this is probably, we're probably about close to 30-some years into this agroforestry system. So we do have, in Europe, decades and actually centuries and millennia of agroforestry experience, also in Finland, but it's been largely, forgotten, or certain practices are the ones that we still recognize. But we can see here that you've got a full stand of wheat and you have a beautiful timber crop coming. This can be planned for. So this farmer, he's got a full, alley of wheat there, but the yield is probably a little bit lower than it was when those trees were a lot smaller, right? However, the value of that timber crop in France, in his context, is worth so much more than the last few years of diminished wheat yield that it more than pays off in total revenue and profitability than the wheat by itself, with never seeing the trees come in, grow, and produce a valuable market for him. So that's something to keep in mind, is that these systems grow and they change, and we can help you plan for that. And I wanted to highlight in the text this really interesting find from a study that looked at the impact of shade and different amounts of shade on the growth of potatoes in Europe. So from Germany, they found that even 26% shade did not produce a significant loss in production of potatoes. Now, southern central Germany is a lot further south than southern Finland, or even central Finland for that matter. So 26% shade might be a bit too much for us to gamble with, and they actually talk about that in that particular paper. But it just goes to show that we do have crops that are pretty well shade adapted. Remember, going back, if we go back to the Lilnagel site here with this drone image, we're looking at 10% shade cover. If we get 10% shade cover, even a little bit more, we could probably grow profitable crops of potatoes in those alleys. Now, the soil isn't really conducive to growing commercial potatoes at that scale, but they could grow there. We could find another crop that does. So just keep that in mind, that these systems change over time, and we want to work with that change to find value at each stage of implementation. Lastly, we have small scale. So you don't always have to plan a silvoarable combination of trees and annuals on a large scale mechanized type operation. The last image is from my original farm where I worked with Novia in Espoo in Finland, where I was growing diverse vegetables and herbs and flowers for direct sale to local customers. So this was a CSA model, and if you're looking at these little beds here, they're 10 meters wide, 75 centimeters across, standardized market garden beds. I was one of the first farms in Finland to use this method, actually. So it wasn't exactly a pilot site, but the size of it meant that I got pretty much to the limits of where I could grow. I was combining existing trees, farmer managed natural regeneration, anyone, with the introduction of annual cash crops. The production without maximizing production, right? So with maximizing a good crop rotation and diversity and interest and different crops for my customers, I was producing 3 tons of vegetables on less than 1,000 square meters of beds. In some part, actually I think in large part, because of the trees that were around. They provided a very good windbreak to the prevailing winds, which is southwest, which is this direction here. So when the wind is coming there throughout most of the year, it hit this leafy tree forest and was slowed down to the point where a lot of my vegetables barely even moved during windstorms because those trees were protecting those vegetables. And every single hour, every single day that my vegetable crops are not fighting to stand up, they do need to move a little bit, but they're not fighting the wind and being rocked around and being stressed out and not losing moisture from exposed soil. All that comes together for really good growing conditions to reach about 3 tons of mixed production per 1,000 square meters. So that's pretty good. If you expand the measurement there from 1,000 square meters of bed space, is just under that, it's like 675 or something, and you include those hedgerows, it still doesn't even get to half a hectare. It's like less than 2,000 square meters actually that all this space was sitting on. So agroforestry can be integrated, and different agroforestry practices can be integrated even into small scale operations. We have local native trees here. We have the beginning of fruit tree systems as hedgerows. So we have windbreaks, we have hedgerows, we have water management zones up at the top of the hill trying to catch water from the parking lot. The number of different systems. So don't think that the size of your farm necessarily limits the kinds of agroforestry you want to do. The size of your farm does create different kinds of design challenges, but at the same time, agroforestry can work from small farms all the way up to larger scale farms. And we have evidence of this from all around the world. Next, silvopasture. Silvopasture is pretty straightforward. Now we're integrating trees with, generally speaking, herbaceous, grassy, forbs, wildflower, herb perennials, right? So we're bringing these into either meadows or pastures, and this is the agroforestry practice that really is going to shine for Finland because it's a lot easier to bring trees, which are perennials, and grasses and meadow species, which are perennials, and create positive interactions between those two groups of species because they both live for at least a few to many years. The difference between a tree growing in a healthy meadow and a tree growing next to a wheat crop is pretty staggering in terms of the competition that can arise between those two things. So while in the wheat field you need to prune the roots of the trees so you're not sucking all the moisture and ruining the ability of a wheat crop to come around, you don't necessarily need to do the same thing when you're integrating with animals. And I'm focusing here on animals because the animals can really benefit from shelter in all seasons. And this is the first photo on the top left. I'm going to have to walk you through the little laser pointer here. This is a thicket of willow that is growing in a pasture for sheep that has been deliberately cleared out on the inside, kind of hollowed out by the farmers in order to create a living barn. So when it's raining, very windy, or very hot, the sheep can go into this dome of branches and leaves of the willows and be protected by the bushes, by the shrubs, from the elements. They also prune and maintain that open space on the inside of the willow because they like to eat everything they can get their mouths on. So once the farmers did the initial work of taking away some of the bigger branches with a chainsaw, well, the sheep then can maintain it going forward. Also, willows do a pretty good job of absorbing urine and nutrients from the feces as well. So you're also getting a double benefit. So as long as you're managing the duration and the numbers of animals so you're not, overusing that living barn, you can actually create a system where by using the infrastructure gets better. So, the more we use built infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily get better, it just means we need to do more maintenance, right? So that's the beauty of having living systems. So living systems can be everything from shade trees, like we see here in the Netherlands. There's one tree, and look at all the cows that are hanging out underneath there, because 25 degrees is all it takes for a lot of animals to really start feeling the heat. And pun intended, they're really starting to feel that heat. They need the shade. So the shade from trees, single trees can make a big difference. Much better, of course, to have a lot of trees because that many animals under that tree, it's not going to take very long for them to damage that tree. So, a proper agroforestry system would probably be a lot better for that farmer if they're interested in natural solutions. Of course, you can you can buy shade mobiles and things like this that you drive around and they have shade cloth and this kind of thing to provide mobile shade for the animals. But a tree is going to provide multifunctional benefits, and it's not, unless you kill it or it goes old and dies or something else happens, it can live for decades and provide those benefits without losing value. It just gains value. Now, finally, I wanted to highlight in the top right a practice that's much more common in Finland, which is forest grazing. So this is taking place at Maivik, which is a biodynamic farm just outside of Helsinki, and they are taking advantage of some support that's now available to manage the edge between forests and fields. And so you come into the actual forest parcel on the edge, and you create a biodiverse transition zone using livestock. And these livestock are now benefiting from a more diverse diet. They don't stay there for very long, but they move through, and you get this animal impact, which you don't really pay for in the same way that you would pay a person to go in there and cut out small trees or to prune things or to do that or the other with tools which depreciate. You've got an appreciating asset in the animal that is doing work for you on the farm. So Silvopasture and the deliberate integration of woody species with animals is a really cool way to integrate appreciating assets into relationships with one another that isn't necessarily available with a silvoarable system. So these are just 3 photographs that give some examples of the power of this kind of system. There's a lot more to talk about with Silvopasture, of course, but this is something that I think we're going to see a lot more of. And I've already heard from a number of farmers that they're having issues in the summer when we get these heat waves and there's no shade available for the animals. Now, you could use the forests that are pretty much ever present on Finnish farms and move the animals in there, but without planning and without really having that as a strategy for grazing and for your farm, simply moving animals into a forest might be useful for a matter of hours or a day, and you bring them some water or something, but it really needs to be planned. And that's, again, something that our project can help with. So I've had a fair bit of text and a lot of explanation about the benefits of those two agroforestry practices, and I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about a few other things kind of in a general level. So I'll start on the top right this time around. And here, these are two images taken by Ben Falk, who's an American farm and property designer. He works with holistic farm planning and permaculture, and he took a trip to, this was Sardinia actually, it wasn't Corsica. He went to Sardinia to observe and document for his own use and for sharing the generations, millennia-long tradition of working with chestnuts and other kinds of nut trees. So Sardinia has had humans living there for, gosh, I think it could even be 25,000 years or something like this. And it has had an insular, of course, it's an island, it has an insular culture, but it's really robust in the fact that people have, continuously lived there. Now their practices have changed and things, but look at the forests that they have on their mountains, and they're full of food-producing species. There have been changes in modern times. This isn't, always what it looks like, but we do have existing systems that are not just a few generations in duration, but we have, it's lasting for entire cultures. So agroforestry actually offers a way for people to integrate with their landscapes in the long term and produce things that look to, on initial sight to be a natural system, but is actually something that is a combination of nature and human activity, which can support our societies for a very long time. And as Finland begins to change, we will see access to more species like this potentially over the next few decades that we could start to bring in. But even using what we already have, we can look to examples like from Sardinia and think, well, how do we want our landscape to look, in 200, 300, or 400 years? Why don't we get started now creating resilient, food-producing, and high-value landscapes that people want to come and visit, which is also a side benefit of agroforestry that you could get into. There's actually research being done on the touristic appeal of landscapes with and without trees, and some of the motivations that farmers and land managers have to plant trees, maybe not for agriculture, but for other reasons. So if we move on and we keep going clockwise, we can see this photo here. This is not what we're thinking about with agroforestry again. It's to create forests on field. Now that might be something that someone decides to do, but in general that's not in agriculture the kind of agroforestry practice that we're looking at, but can be. If you want to transition away from annual cropping and go to silvopasture, and you want to create new environments on your farm that are perennial and you have animal integration, you could do that, but something this dense probably wouldn't take place. The reason this picture is here is to highlight our position in Uusimaa of being this stepping stone for the migration of species that I was just talking about into Finland. We're the first line, along with the southwest of Finland and Åland Islands, and you start moving up the coast a little bit too, from Turku to Uusikaupunki, Rauma, that area where we have a more favorable habitat. This is where species are going to become more prevalent and also move into as our climate changes. So we're the place where we get to actually get started with trialing the next species that they may not move throughout all of Finland, but could become more useful in the future. So I wanted to highlight the fact that we have a lot of biodiversity here, relative speaking, and we can use that to our advantage. So just because something works for your context on your farm doesn't mean that it's not worth doing because someone else somewhere further north can't do it. They have their own advantages and disadvantages that they need to work through. So you should always think about where you are and your farm is and where you want your farm to be so that you create a system that works rather than, deliberately reducing your options because it's unfair for some reason. It's odd, but sometimes I get this argument that, it works for you, but it doesn't work for me. Well, every design of agroforestry has to be context specific. So that leads us to the other half of this slide, and we have 3 images from the same farm. So this is the host farm. This actual site there is in Espoo, and the 2 photographs of soil and plants are from the part of the farm that are in Kirkkonummi. And within just a few years, we've started aggregating this clay loam soil. We're feeding earthworms that were very low population, or in some cases seemingly absent from our soil, through the combination of different practices. So agroforestry is the deliberate inclusion of woody plants in agriculture. And what that means is you really have to start thinking about the relationships between the different kinds of enterprises and different kinds of management. So in that particular field, we are really pushing with the biological diversity, creating changes to soil and improving the habitat for our cash crops. It's a pilot project. We're testing ideas there, and it's a lot of fun. But some of these things do actually come out and become useful for the rest of the project. You know, seeing soil go from what generally looks like concrete to having aggregation 8 centimeters deep in just a couple years without using a lot of inputs is pretty good. And this is something that translates into how do you put an agroforestry system into practice? Does agroforestry start when you put the tree in the ground, or does it start somewhere else? And that's a huge bit of this project, is to move the focus away from the trees, stop thinking about the trees for a while, and include all of these other steps about how you get to the tree and get to a healthy tree. Because what we don't want to do is have farmers in Finland repeat the same mistakes that farmers have already made elsewhere, which is sticking trees into places they're not ready to grow yet. We can help you improve your soil so that you can put the trees in when it's the right time. All right, so now let's look at Finland a little bit more. So in your mind, you might be thinking, like, we already have a lot of trees here. Why would we want to do more? Well, hopefully the last few slides have illustrated some of the benefits that bringing trees into the landscape can bring for you and your farm and the environment. But let's look at some of these things that I see kind of holding things back sometimes in Finland. So here, we have forests to the water's edge. Unless there's a barrier to trees, it seems like trees cover everything. Now, just because we have a lot of trees doesn't mean that every part of our landscape is actually getting benefits from the services those trees could provide if they were there. So an area without trees doesn't get those benefits. So it's like, for example, there are how many, supermarkets in Finland? Quite a few. But if you live 200 kilometers, nobody lives 200 kilometers. If you live 50 kilometers from the nearest supermarket or place that you can buy food, you're not really getting the same benefit from that supermarket because the investment to go is so high that you can't pop in for a normal visit, and there's all these other things you have to think about. You're not getting the full range of services that the supermarket or the shopping center can provide to you because you're so far away. Now, does that mean you build a supermarket in your field? That's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is, if you've got a place where, going back to agroforestry, where you've removed trees from hundreds of meters all around, and you start noticing that you have damage to your crops from wind, well, is it necessarily because the crops themselves are susceptible to wind? Could be. It could be they have a nutritional deficiency, so they're structurally weak. Maybe they don't have enough calcium or silica or something else, and so they're not really robust, healthy plants, so the first breeze that comes, they go. Or it could be you're growing a really healthy crop, but there's a storm of significant severity that it breaks your plants, even though you've done everything right. Well, bringing trees away from the forest and back into your farm as a windbreak could potentially reduce the chance of that happening again in the future. So just because we have a lot of trees doesn't mean we're getting all the benefits from having a lot of trees. Each site is unique and has its own relationship to the ecosystem. And I do recognize, moving on, that we have harsh winters. Even southern Finland, minus 25, minus 30 exceptionally is definitely possible. And that creates a number of challenges for the species diversity that we have. The snow is a problem because we have a lot of rodents that live underneath the snow and they start working on the roots and everything there. I understand that there are problems, there are tricks. It's not as if you plant trees and they suddenly just start giving you all these benefits. It's the design, planning, and management of the system that brings the benefits, all right? So just because there's deep snow, well, we have techniques that can help you get around the problems that come with that. Deep shade, well, once again, we have planning. When we have chainsaws, we can understand what the pattern of light and shadow is on a particular field and help you choose the kind of agroforestry practice that is either not going to create more shade if you already have too much, or potentially is going to make use of that shade by giving you a shade-tolerant cash crop that could, outperform placing a sun-demanding crop in the shade just because you feel you have to. So, these things are multifaceted. I also want to recognize that trees haven't been the only obstacle to creating productive agricultural landscapes in Finland. Finland is a very exceptional place. We have a lot of similarities to other parts of the world, but people have put in a lot of work, and that's what this pile of stones coming out of different different fields here is demonstrating, is that this is a centuries-long effort in order to have clear fields. So what we don't want to do is introduce trees and shrubs in a way that interfere and reduce the productivity of our landscapes. What we're trying to do is introduce trees and shrubs to increase the productivity of our landscapes. All right? So just because something is put into the field and becomes an obstacle doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to burden or reduce the efficiency of the farming system. That's a planning and design challenge that we have tools to get over. Last but not least, Finland, we're the northernmost cereal producer. We've got something like half of all agricultural land that's north of 60 degrees latitude. And that's something to celebrate, right? I mean, this is something that's pretty amazing. That's very different. You go 60 degrees north in North America, you're in Alaska. You're way outside of a temperate environment. We're the last kind of place that benefits from the Gulf Stream, the North Atlantic Current, and we want to recognize that and support it. So what we're not trying to do is fundamentally alter the agricultural landscape and saying that we need to plant forests everywhere with agroforestry. We want to strategically bring agroforestry in to improve on what has already happened. Now, if you remember from the beginning, there were a number of slides that I want to go to, but these are just hitting the highlights. So we have other presentations and workshops that talk about how to do these things, but I wanted to give you guys this now in case you're interested. So if you think about how you do agroforestry, I've got three main things. You need to study, plan, and scale with your competence. All right, so studying means understanding the work that has already been done in Finland, not just our project. There have been multiple agroforestry projects, and we have a history of agroforestry in Finland. So we want to study the history and the application of agroforestry here, as well as in other similar places around the world, as well as dissimilar. We'll get to that. We want to plan our agroforestry systems thoroughly, so we understand the relationships that we're creating or we might create, and we want to make sure that we're putting the agroforestry in the best possible locations. We don't want to be putting agroforestry into the wrong context because it's just not going to work. And then finally, I want to recognize that although a lot of Finns have tremendous forestry skills, so many farmers are also managing forests, agroforestry does require different skill sets. And we don't recommend that people start scaling out agroforestry systems all across their farm without having built some of those skills to begin with. So we really highlight the idea of starting small. Start small, set up a pilot system, run it through, especially the first few years, which can be the most difficult, and see how it feels before pushing it out to the other parts of the landscape. So we can take the planning process and focus it on these candidate locations that are most likely to be beneficial and get you started in a place that it's going to be probably successful. And then once you, okay, now I see how this works. Oh, this is something I need to change in the workflow, which will save me money, make it more efficient, increase the tree survivability, whatever it may be. Because the real learning comes from doing, not just from studying and planning. If we look at those in a little bit more detail, for our pilot project, we did a lot of planning and studying in a way that we weren't going to fundamentally alter the fact that this farm, he likes to produce cereals, legumes, oilseed crops. We can integrate trees with that system. We can integrate biodiversity with that system. It's possible to do, but it does require planning. And so I wanted to just put this on here because some people might think that some of these practices aren't going to work here. All of these practices work. It's how you implement them and how you design them. Okay. So it doesn't mean that you can't implement it poorly. It doesn't mean that your agroforestry system has no chance of failure. It absolutely does. Absolutely, you do have chances of failure. But the idea that it's impossible for the practice to work is the opposite side. We always fail or always work. Neither of those things are true. The truth is somewhere in the middle. When we think about studying, in our project, we try to focus on first principles so you understand the basics about how trees and shrubs function, the differences between them and annual crops, and some of the trade-offs you'll have to consider. We'll try to open your mind, if we look here at this image on the bottom right, to the way that agroforestry practices are being advanced and developed in other countries and other climates, so you can start to think a little bit outside of the box, that it doesn't necessarily need to be a monoculture of one species on the edge of the field. There are unique and very interesting practices that are coming from all over the world that you can adapt when you understand the first principles to our location. And it's a lot easier to look at systems that are very different from ours so that you get that aha moment about pattern recognition. So you can see how the different species that don't survive in Finland, like these bananas or eucalyptus, or we have jackfruit, mangoes, and other things in here, how they interact and change over time. All right, so we want to do a lot of studying to understand how these systems work. And also to study that, agroforestry is not the only game in town. Agroforestry is actually something that, from my own personal belief, is highly complex. If we look at the agroforestry systems on this plot that I helped create for the EU CAP Network focus group on crop associations, is any time we bring different plants together, is that they're more complex, and they usually operate on a large landscape, although you can do smaller scale systems. So they're usually something that requires a fair bit of confidence before you put it into practice. But it doesn't mean that you can't do something to prepare the way and gain skills that transfer to agroforestry by using other kinds of regenerative crop association and other types of practices on your farm. So we have an entire proposal for farmers on how to expand that timeline from planting all the way back to soil formation, and we help you study that. We also help you plan with many different kinds of tools. So if you're intimidated to use digital tools, we can also use manual, just paper and pencil. I do a lot of drawing and everything. Something just flew down there. I do a lot of my own work, by hand rather than on the computer, because I like to have different ways of looking at the same problem. So we help you where you are and where you feel confident using different kinds of tools, although we really do try to push to some degree the digitalization of the farm planning, because it transfers and scales a lot easier than paper, right? It is easier, there is a learning curve, but some of the benefits you can get from using tools like QGIS. This is just a kind of a beautiful topographic map of the main farm area where our pilot site is, highlighting the difference between the ring of hills and the the stream running down into the valley bottom, the actual primary valley of the landscape. We can help you create things like this and how to interpret what that means for the farm, but we can also do it in other ways. Now, this other picture is more dreamy, isn't it? So we're looking up at the clouds. This was some of the first thunderstorms in 2023 when we had a drought for 2 months, and some of the first rain was finally starting to come. And I highlight this picture because it gets me thinking about the future of our climate. And generally speaking, I've only talked about climate a little bit here and there. I've actually only talked about carbon a little bit here and there. Climate is changing, and it's generally getting warmer, and we think that Finland will see more rainfall, more precipitation, and probably coming because of the amount of energy in the atmosphere, and more intense thunderstorms like this beautiful thunderhead that was forming there in Kirkkonummi. Agroforestry systems can help us plan for those futures. We can start to now proactively implement the practices that are going to allow our farming systems to be resilient and productive into the future. But if we wait 20 years to say, oh man, we really should have planted some trees, we're going to be playing catch up in a rapidly changing environment if the climate changes as fast as some of the models say that it probably will. So let's take that into consideration now that we're trying to make our landscapes useful for the future. We're handing something off to the next generation that not only should benefit us here and now, but is also going to pay dividends for them in the long run. Scale. So some of what we've shown so far often has been from smaller scale pilot projects or my micro farm. That farm in France was actually quite large when we did the Silvoarable system. But I wanted to put this picture here of a crew planting out a 750 hectare chestnut system in the United States. So different climates have different species that are viable, and they have different business plans. But I wanted to put this in here because these kinds of investments, you don't get a crew of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are 12 people in this frame alone planting out this system. You don't pay for a system like that without there being some kind of investment. And a lot of times you have these people looking for carbon funds and things like this. We shouldn't think that we can't achieve this level of project in Finland. This is going to be possible for us. It may not be chestnuts, but we certainly can put together a project plan that is going to work on a large scale and pay dividends into the future. So I just wanted to inspire you with this, this stuff is coming. Investors are looking for ways to get on board with agroforestry. It's tricky. It's not always recommended. There are pitfalls to different kinds of funding schemes, but these systems do scale, and they're being adopted at scale. So don't think that this is just for home gardeners and people who have really silly ideas about biodiversity and soil formation and this kind of thing. Serious people, large farmers, so to speak, not that we're not serious on a smaller scale, are also taking the steps to put their money where their mouth is and to begin to future-proof their farms. Finally, we get to the next steps. I don't have a timer in front of me, so I'm not exactly sure how I'm doing for time, but we're basically finished. If any of this has been interesting for you, please contact us. Reach out directly, establish a line of communication. If you want to do that through email, that's great. If you want to do it by phone, we can also talk on the phone. But ultimately, if you're still interested in agroforestry for your farm in Finland, we can arrange a one-on-one session using Teams. It's a lot easier than commuting all across Uusimaa for our first visit. But we can make that first contact via Teams and talk about your farm's context. What do you know about agroforestry? Where are you with that? Are you considering regenerative agriculture as a whole, or agroecology? Are you organic? Are you conventional? What kind of things do we need to say or present to you that could convince you that agroforestry is worth investigating? And if you think that it is, then it would be great for you to join our agroforestry design teams, which we have introductory events to coming up already this week at the time of posting of this video, but also the next 2 weeks we'll have 2 more online events that you'll find information for underneath this video, as well as 2 in-person recruitment events where we talk about the design teams in more detail. What are we doing with the design team? How does it function? What do we provide you? What do we expect from your participation? Why are we doing it? And if that's interesting for you, join our agroforestry design team and welcome aboard. Now, the project does run until the end of 2026. So if you miss this initial membership drive or this sign up for the agroforestry design team, you can join later. Hopefully not too much later that you've missed some of the key workshops, but we're definitely flexible and we want to help as many farmers as we can. So don't feel excluded because maybe you saw this and you got interested at a later date. Now I will go ahead and say that if you see this in September of 2026, that you missed the boat because we're definitely trying to finish up the 3-year project and get everything to Elukeskus and publish everything by the end of that calendar year. But if you're seeing this in 2025 and it's spring or early summer, by all means reach out, make an appointment, get in contact with us. So at last and not least, thank you for your attention. I do enjoy giving these lectures and presentations. I want to share my knowledge and experience and how I see things with a wide audience. So that's why we're recording this. So it's not just a one-off. There are links here to our website. We'll put clickable links on YouTube below to the Agroforestry in Nyland website, which is the home of all of our work packages, as well as there's that link there to the Lil Nagel's Agroforestry Pilot Project, which has its own standalone website, because that project has been grandfathered into this bigger process because it's a few years old now. My contact information is there. And you can also find my phone number through Novia or the project website, but it's generally not good to put your phone number just on a screen like this. So contact me, contact Haiti. We'll happily answer your questions. And without further ado, thank you and goodbye.